Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. This is my first time at at Maze. And this venue is absolutely insane, so I do not feel cool enough to be here. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you. So the talk I'm going to be doing today is Interactivity in Virtual Reality. So just the agenda of today's talk, what I'm going to cover and go through. So first I'm going to have a little look back in time at 2016 and show what virtual reality brought and what we learned from 2016. Then I'm going to narrow that down and have a look at what 2016 taught us about interactivity in virtual reality. And I'm going to break that down into the visuals, the audio, and the input on the side of interactivity in virtual reality. And then we're going to take a little peek into the future to see what virtual reality and interactivity has to offer this year and beyond. Just a little note on the fact that this talk is completely code-free, so it's across disciplines and it's also across interactive medias, so we're all friends here. There's a lot of content for everybody. The content of this talk has been built from the development community that myself and fellow evangelists have seen. So by the end of this talk, you should have some useful hints and tips of what other developers have been doing that you can take and put into your work yourself or draw inspiration from. So just a little introduction about who I am. So I'm Liz Mercuri. I'm the Educational Evangelist at Unity, based in Brighton, the Brighton studio, which is super cool. And I recently graduated in a master's in computer game software development, in which the research focus was virtual reality and interactivity, but more focused on the horror genre, which is a completely different topic. And if you want to talk about that, please come and grab me after, because I could talk about it forever. So on with the show then. So 2016, it was dubbed the year of VR. It was the year that virtual reality became commercially available. We had the PlayStation VR, we had the HTC Vive. We welcomed it into our homes. And so I'm just going to take a little look back at what 2016 brought us. And it's probably something that you're all familiar with, but it's just to get us all on the same page before I go into the interactivity side of things. So if we look at the types of platforms that we saw in 2016, we had the mobile devices, so we had like the cardboard now going on to the Google Daydream with input. And so this is the side of the market that is more accessible. Almost everybody has a mobile phone. And you'll find that the input on these devices is a lot more simplified, and also that side of the market is probably the more accessible in terms of cost as well. It's a lot cheaper if compared to like tethered devices. When I speak about tethered devices, I mean like the PlayStation VR or the Oculus Rift, which have more adept input systems and can create more complex interactions and experiences, but you need really high-level, high-end hardware to run it, and they're usually a little bit more costly. So they're like the two sides of the spectrum of the virtual reality hardware that we saw in 2016. If we look then at the types of experiences that these hardwares offered, maybe the simplest form is the one-button input. So this is on the Google Cardboard, where we have a catch at the side that we can press, or on the Gear VR, where we can sort of slide on the side. So we've got that really simple one-button input. Going one step further, we have controllers and hand tracking. So the usual controllers that we're used to, that we see with our PlayStations and Xboxes, but also looking now at the Oculus controllers and the Vive controllers too. And then finally, the sort of highest level of interaction that we've got right now is the room scale VR, so the HTC Vive. And with this, not only comes the ideas of the interactivity and the cost, but also where we're going to put that. So we need the space big enough to be able to use these experiences now. So there's a lot of considerations that came out of 2016 regarding virtual reality. So at the end of 2016 then, and very early in 2017, what were the conclusions that were drawn from the development community? Well, the first was that there's no market for it yet. And I just want to warn you that this slide makes virtual reality sound very bleak, but bear with me, okay? So we should all be proud for the fact that there are some really impressive numbers up there of how virtual reality was adopted in the marketplace. And it seems unfair, but if we compare that to sort of the console market, so if we look that there's maybe 40 million PlayStation 4 units available worldwide, and about 90,000 PSVR units at the end of February this year, that's only 2% of the console market for PlayStation. Similarly, if you look at the Gear VR, 5 million units, but only 2 million of those are active users. So when we look at the figures in that kind of respect, we can see that there's a demand for it, and that there's a lot of potential there, but we aren't quite at that market yet. Similarly to that, there's no standards yet. So a lot of what you will see in this presentation today are what a lot of different development studios have adopted. And I'm not saying that any of them are the right way. I'm not saying that any of them are the ones that you should be going with. These standards are still being adopted, and it's an iterative process that we're all building on. And finally, there's no killer application yet. And again, this sounds really mean because I'm comparing it to console. When I say killer application, I mean like when everyone went out and bought an Xbox when Halo came out. There's been nothing yet that said, hey, I really want to buy this for virtual reality. Or to my knowledge. I guess it's debatable. So this talk is about interactivity in virtual reality. So I think it's poignant to define what I mean by interactivity. And this is taken from Jesse Schell. So interactivity is defined as the two-way flow of communication between the player and the game or the machine. And this interactivity happens through the user interface. So the user interface is the area that allows this two-way communication to flow. And if that's put into action, it means that the player has a good user experience with that interaction. And this interactivity is defined in 3 parts. So the physical input that we use, so our controllers, our input screen, our input keyboards and mouses, and then what we get back from the experience from the game or the machine. So this could be audio or an output, a visual output. Then there's the simulated world environment that we play using the inputs. And then finally, there's that in-game virtual UI, which, when all those are put together, when they're mapped together, this is what creates really cohesive user experience. So this is what we would expect from non-VR games. And this, again, adapts to virtual reality games too. But when we look at interactivity with virtual reality, there's a few more nuances to be aware of. So the first is that we're not only taking user input from controllers and keyboards now, we're now taking in head movement. We're now taking in the head-mounted displays of the virtual reality experiences. And there's something to be said for not just putting in virtual reality because you want to make a virtual reality game. As developers, it's important to think about what virtual reality, what this extra input could add to the experience that you're creating. How can it inform the story or maybe the mechanics that are in there? Because if it's just put in there because you want virtual reality, it feels a little bit alien and it's quite obvious and breaks that interactivity. Maybe the most obvious part of it is that we're now in that virtual world. And you'll find that anybody who puts on a virtual reality headset for the first time will just smash everything up, or just look around and try and find all the glitches and try and find everything that's wrong or isn't quite real. And again, that's a big challenge for developers. There's that extra level of fidelity that you need to be aware of and have an appreciation of when creating those experiences for virtual reality. And then aside from the obvious, there's a whole new level of complications to deal with. I've been doing this talk for about 5 minutes, and I've mentioned motion sickness already. There's going to be a little bit more on that later. Fatigue and session length, again, virtual realities is this, we've had a new iteration of the technology, so it's getting people used to that, getting consumers used to that. And then there's the locomotion. I've got a whole section of this later in the talk about how you would move around the virtual environment in the most comfortable way for the players. And then there's the idea of the UI itself. If you are going to put GUI in your game, how you spatially place that, and also the resolution is quite important and to bear in mind when using virtual reality. Because if you sort of have it as a child object to the camera and it's too close, it can cause eye strain pretty quickly for the player. Yet if you put it too far away, you have the same problem because the player's squinting at it. So it's a lot of user testing to find what that sweet spot is. So there's quite a lot to consider in that. So that's a bit of a recap of virtual reality as a whole. So now I'm going to take you through sort of what the developers did in 2016 and give a hints and tips onto the ideas of interactivity with virtual reality. So the first thing that I'm going to start with is the visuals. So this is Land's End by Us 2. Has anybody played it? Yeah. It's really nice. If you're wanting to introduce somebody to virtual reality for the first time, this is a really nice, relaxed sort of way into virtual reality, and I'd recommend it. So show it to your mum or your gran and say, hey, this is virtual reality. It's quite nice to get them used to it. So the visuals then. Although there's quite a lot of platforms for virtual reality, like I said, we've got these mobile devices and we've got the tethered ones, you'll find that a lot of the platforms use the same techniques. So cube maps are usually used to encompass the world, and then you'll find that developers will use a lot of pre-calculations, so sort of pre-calculated lighting and shadows and that kind of thing. And when I say smoke and mirrors, I mean making the world look richer, making it look like there's more there than there actually is. So a lot of the developers use a process called billboarding, which is much like using static images. And it may seem a bit basic to use static images. You may think, I want to go into virtual reality and make this amazing, rich world. But actually, don't underestimate the idea of simplicity in virtual reality. There's a lot of experiences that use very low graphics, very low poly models, or 3D or static images that actually have a really great impact on the experience that they're trying to convey. One of the things that I would recommend that we found when developing for virtual reality is to not use post-processing effects, as they can be quite costly, and it's super important to keep the performance up with virtual reality. But definitely, if you are going to use anything that's costly, use anti-aliasing. Because when you're in virtual reality, you may not be aware of the fact that actually you have a lot of involuntary head movements. And so the edges of the geometry are more obvious than ever. And if the anti-aliasing isn't spot on, it super induces or adds towards motion sickness pretty quickly. And on the subject of motion sickness, so motion sickness affects a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. And actually, in real life, I'm not motion sick at all. But when I develop in VR for long periods of time, I definitely haven't found my VR legs just yet. So yes. So what did we find from the development community that caused the most motion sickness? Well, we spoke to SIG-Trap games. They did a game called Sublevel Zero, where it's sort of free movement, you're in a spaceship experience. Don't know if anyone's tried it. It's super good. But there's a lot of free movement in that, a lot of rolling, a lot of fast movement. And so they did quite a big user testing on what caused the most motion sickness in this scenario, in this game that they were creating. And what they pulled from it actually was that there was two things. The first thing was that rotation on any axis definitely caused more motion sickness than movement. So any sort of rotation, so doing barrel rolls is a bad idea. And that they also found that acceleration, so changes in speed as opposed to constant speed, also caused a lot of motion sickness too. So like with the roll being particularly bad. So what tips can we give you on motion sickness for your experiences then? So like I said earlier about having VR legs, as developers, as a developer myself, I often forget that a lot of people haven't tried virtual reality. So I'll throw them into an experience without really warning them about it. And I've seen this in a lot of other experiences that I've tried myself. So it's really important to give the player something familiar that they can get a grasp of before they go into the virtual reality themselves. Because virtual reality is hard to get used to itself. So if you're giving them this alien world they've never been in and on top of virtual reality, it's completely overwhelming for the senses. So maybe give them a simple mechanic to get started, or give them something familiar, an action that's really familiar that they can get used to, and embed them in really slowly before you go into the whole experience. A really great tip that I've seen used a lot and I think works really well is having a frame of reference. So a frame of reference is something that's always constant on the screen that the player can focus on. And that leading the eye is a really good way of grounding the player, giving them stability and stopping that feeling of motion sickness. And along with that idea of having a frame of reference, if, like Sublevel 0, you are in an environment where you're wanting to portray the stimuli of the world, so in Sublevel 0, for example, you're in a spaceship, and when you get hit, it shakes to show that you've taken damage. And what they found out was that it was a lot better to shake that frame of reference rather than the camera itself. So this is just an example of that. As they're accelerating, it's the spaceship around the player that's shaking, not the camera itself. And again, that gives the player a sense of having stability and something central to ground them in the world. And like I said earlier about the acceleration being a big cause of motion sickness, what they found was that players preferred the movements to be fast and short. So rather than easing into, like for example, I saw a virtual reality experience earlier in the week where you were an astronaut, and actually the movements in the game were quite quick. And I said to them, have you tried slowing this down to simulate that you're an astronaut? And they were like, oh yeah, and everyone we tested it on, they just felt really sick, so we had to speed it back up. So it seems to be that the general consensus is that fast movements, short movements are the best for keeping motion sickness out of the experience. So again, these are the fast, short movements that we saw in Sublevel 0. So on to the second part then, audio. So audio in non-virtual reality games are easy to do in Unity. So in Unity, for example, I'm going to give us an example. So we have our audio listener and we have our audio source. So we have our audio source in the world that we can position anywhere in the virtual reality world that emits the sound. Then we have the listener, which takes that and translates that sound to the player. So it very easily allows you to position sounds in the 3D world as you would expect if you were just walking around. If you were walking around a forest and you expected to hear water running or crickets, you could place those sounds accordingly. Again, as the listener passes through them, you can split the audio over 2 channels, so you get that feeling of distance. So your sound could be a little bit further away if the listener's further away, so you could hear running water in the distance and that kind of thing. So it gives you an idea of spatial, there being a spatial world in which your player is. Unity also has this idea of reverberation filters. So wherever the listener is, you can have a reverberation zone which simulates the materials of the world, which is really important in virtual reality to be able to simulate, if, for example, you're moving into an area of grass to cavern and simulating that echoing and that hollowness of sound. Then the Doppler effect, again, is similar to what I said earlier about having that idea of distance. So the Doppler effect, I like to use the example of a car. So if a car comes past you, if it's in the distance, you hear it getting closer. It's the loudest when it's right in front of you, and then you slowly hear it going away, and the sound fades away. That idea of the Doppler effect. And again, you can also mix the audio to be able to get the desired effects that you want, and the volumes that you want, and the effects. So if we take those ideas and then translate them into virtual reality and have a look at the added complexities that are needed to adapt the sounds to virtual reality. We have this idea of an inter-aural time difference. So in virtual reality, it's a lot more obvious, this idea of distance. So if a sound plays, the time that it takes to get from one ear, the delay, and then the other ear, it's so much more obvious in virtual reality to identify that it doesn't feel natural. So you need to get that time delay between the ears just right to be able to simulate that. And that completely depends on the reverberation, the type of environment you're in, and also the audio that you're using yourselves. Along with that, there's the level difference too. So it's not just the time that it takes, but also the sound between the ears too, which again needs to be super precise so you can trick the mind while you're in virtual reality. Oops. And then lastly, and probably the most intricate one, is spectral filtering. So this is the sound that we do naturally. It's the way that our outer ears, what are they called, filter the sound depending on where it's coming from. And so we take it for granted in the real world that we hear sounds from different positions and we just hear them. We don't have this appreciation of the spectral filtering that's done in real life. But in virtual reality, if you hear a sound coming from behind you or around you, it's just a lot more obvious that it doesn't sound quite right. So the good news is that the virtual reality SDKs that are available actually do all this for you. Hooray! So I know like Google VR, for example, and the Oculus SDK, they have they have the functions of sort of the interaural time difference and volume in there already. And they also, thankfully, perform some calculations for the spectral filtering too. And also, a cool thing is that they're often optimized. So like the Google VR SDK, for example, does all the audio on a separate thread. So it's optimized really well, which is really nice. So if you are going to use an SDK for your audio in virtual reality, just have a few hints and tips to take away for that as well. So the first is to use clean audio, so no audio with effects on, no audios with reverbs or filters, because this will just distort what the SDK does to it, what magic it will put on it. So clean audio. Secondly, it sounds really obvious, but use recognizable sounds. So I played a game called Monstrum, which was a game where you were on a ship. It was like a procedurally generated ship, and you were being chased by monsters. And each one of the monsters has a different sound. But actually, the team that created it, even though the monsters were all made up, they used recognizable sounds. So they used really heavy footsteps, they used heavy breathing and deep growls, rather than creating their own sound effects and making something unusual. Because they found that if you played a sound that players already had real-life experience of, like, for example, a growling wolf or like heavy breathing, they already had the connotation of what it meant. So it was a lot easier to be able to convince them of the experience that they were in. So it sounds obvious, but it's really effective in virtual reality. With the spectral filtering and the placing of sounds, we found that it was a really good idea to animate the sound source. So to move the sound source around the area that it's in, it allows the SDK to get a lot more to calculate the spectral filtering to make the sound a lot more realistic. So just moving the sound source around in the area that it's meant to be in, which sounds weird, but it works really well. And repeating the sound as well. That's another one for the spectral filtering to really get the best experience with the sound there. And using complex sounds. So when I say that, I mean trying to use something of high volume and trying to use something that's a little bit more complex than like a simple ding or a tick. Try and use a sound file that's got a lot of different frequencies to it. So the SDK can do a lot more with it. And the way that someone in the office described this to me is that if you add a filter to a black image, you can't really see much of a difference. But if you add a filter to a color image that's got lots of colors and lots of intricate details in there, the filter that you apply just makes it a lot more richer and you can see more of a difference. And that's the same when you look at using sounds in virtual reality with the SDKs that are already available. So on to the last part of the interaction side of things, the input. So I'm just going to go through a few input techniques. So the first, and one that's actually said to be the most simple, is the gaze. So a lot of people say that this is the most basic form of input. And it is probably the most simple to implement, and with a lot of devices, it's the only input that you have, such as the Google Cardboard, for example. So this is an example of the input. So you can see we're getting that feedback from the UI. So if there's an object that can be interacted with, the reticule will change size, and the object that we can interact with changes color. And so this is a really simple way to use gaze. And also, we can use it for aiming as well, and then use the one-touch button to shoot, for example. Has anyone played the London Heist that was part of PlayStation VR Worlds? Yeah, I think gaze, people say, is the most simplest form of input, but if it's used well, it can be really effective. So in the London Heist, you have been kidnapped by a gangster, and in one particular scene, you're being interrogated by him. And so you're tied to a chair, but you have free movement with your head. And if you glance over to the exit, he comes in really close to you and like says, "Don't think you can get away," or "I know what you're up to," kind of thing. And I think that's a really cool way of using gaze. I think that really added to the experience. And I remember when I played it, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, she's onto me." So I thought that was really cool. Cool way to use it. And also, it's really great for people with disabilities. So there's a charity called Special Effect, and I very recently went to an event where they were showing input that they were using gaze, that were allowing children who couldn't use controllers that we take for granted. So they had gaze input to play football, and so they would look around where they wanted the football to go, and they would blink to fire the ball. So yeah, I think gaze, people say, is the most simple, but actually I think it's probably one of the most effective, and also one that's making a difference. So I think that's great. It shouldn't be underestimated. So the next form of input is motion controls. So here I'm talking about sort of the PlayStation Move controllers and also the Google Daydream controller. And for example, input like the Google Daydream controller, it doesn't have directional input. It has an accelerometer, so you know how fast you're moving the device, and a gyroscope, so you know the rotation of it. And actually using those two elements together can create a really high fidelity experience. So this ninja game that you see here, there's no directional tracking there. It's just all gyroscope. And accelerometer to make this chopping game, and it's really cool. I think it works really well. So then if we look at hand tracking then, so these are the Vive controllers and the Oculus Touch. So these allow to take the interaction just one step closer. So like with the Oculus controllers, you can use the hand gestures, and it's just a lot easier to mimic the real world inputs that we used, sort of picking things up, throwing things, and using our hands. It's just a lot easier to map that to these sorts of controllers and create a much more immersive experience. I found a lot of people using these controllers when they've been in a virtual reality experience for a few minutes, they kind of forget, and it just becomes second nature. So if anyone is wanting to have a little play with the idea of input and what you can do, I would really recommend Newton VR. There's the URL at the bottom. It's open source, and you can get that and have a little look. In Newton VR, uses input controllers, and it just gives examples of lots of different things that you can do. So picking things up, throwing things, pushing buttons, pulling levers, opening doors. So there's lots of different examples of input in virtual reality and how to implement them and how they look. And I think it's just a really great playground, really, for interactivity in virtual reality. So yeah, that's Newton VR. So on the subject of interaction then, I just wanted to mention physical inventories. So has anyone played Fantastic Contraption? Oh, I love Fantastic Contraption. It's fantastic. So one of the great things about that is that all the menus are in the world. So there's no really like GUI. It's all in the world themselves. So this cat, for example, he's your inventory to get all your tools. And you can give him a little fuss, which I absolutely love. And then you can pick up all the tools that you need. Thank you, Mr. Cat. And then when you don't need him, you just throw him away. And I'm not in the business of throwing cats, but I just think that that is wonderful. I love that it's just so integral to the world, and it's just so intuitive. Don't recommend throwing cats. But yeah, I just think it's a really great example of extending the interactivity of that virtual reality experience by actually having inventories and that kind of thing, and menus inherent in the world. So then the final little point of part of the interaction then is the locomotion. So how we move around the world, how we move around the virtual reality world. And there's a lot of methods in this. And like I say, there's no right one. There's no rule book written. These are just a selection of what we've seen studios use and which have been quite effective. So the first one is teleportation. So teleportation allows you to point at where you want to be and orientate your rotation and then teleport to that place. So there's no walking or movement involved. There's no room for nausea or motion sickness. You just simply teleport there. Another one is walking on the spot. And we do have like the Virtuix Omni out there, which is the virtual reality treadmill. I've seen that at a lot of trade shows that supports this kind of locomotion in virtual reality games. So the idea of walking on the place and then reorientating yourself on the spot. Freezing the world is not one that I've seen often, but have seen it used. So in freezing the world, if you're using the Vive and you're in room scale, freezing the world allows you to walk around the room, get to where the bounds of your living room are, freeze the world, turn yourself around, and then carry on from where you are physically, but the world is frozen in place. And I've not actually tried this, so I can't comment on how this helps with immersion or not. But yeah, this is another one that's been adopted. And again, this one's not one that I've seen used very often, but this is the holosphere. And so in this one, you have the world, and you can reach out and grab the world towards you. So it's the world that you're pulling towards you rather than you moving yourself. So yeah, that's another one that I've not seen used very often, but is in use, which is pretty cool. There's this cool game called Budget Cuts, I believe, which actually uses the teleportation and reorientation as a game mechanic, which works really nice. So it's a bit like Portal, so you point where you want to go, but then the world engulfs you, and then you're there. So it's like you're being teleported, portaled there, and it just works really nice. I thought that was pretty cool. And then similarly, locomotion being inherent in the game design. So Triangular Pixels made this really great game called Unseen Diplomacy. And Triangular Pixels are really cool. If you're wanting to look more on interaction and virtual reality, I would definitely check them out. They're fantastic. So in Unseen Diplomacy, they use this idea of redirected walking, which I guess is a bit like freezing the world, but it does it in games. So in Unseen Diplomacy, it makes full use of the space that you would have in your living room. So you're continuously going back on yourself, but you're not aware of it. So you could, example, be going up spiral staircase or going through an air vent, and it feels like you're going to a different area, but actually you're just retreading the old ground in a really clever way. So the future of interactivity then. So I can't look into the future. I can't tell the future, unfortunately. It would be a very cool superpower. But one thing is for sure is that there is a demand for it. I mean, all you people are here because you're wanting to learn about interactivity and virtual reality, and that's fantastic. There's a lot of experiences being created, there's lots of innovation, and it's really exciting. And as I showed at the beginning about this emerging market, there's definitely a demand for it, and that's super inspiring. And so what I want to say then is that everything that I've told you today, I want you to take away, I want you to take it away, I want you to use parts of it, I want you to rip it up, I want you to adopt it to what you're making, and just really use it to innovate what you're creating. Because I think one of the important things is sharing what we've learned, but also sharing what we don't know. And I think events like this is a really great way to be able to share our experiences, what we've learned, and I think that's important in the innovation of this field and driving it forward. So I encourage you all to do that. Yes, thank you for having me for this talk. I would like to invite questions. That sounded more sinister than I wanted. Yes, please. You? Yeah. So the question is, I'm just going to repeat it for everybody. So the question is, do I feel that bigger studios, do I feel that bigger studios will be able to create more high-fidelity experiences? Is that what you mean?
I thought about franchises branching out.
Okay.
To be honest, like having a Super Mario virtual reality experience. And maybe that's not the best point to start from, but you get what I mean.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting because I think because virtual reality we're having a new iteration of it. It's great to see larger franchises and also new franchises being created that are adopting it, and I think they're all learning things from each other. So I know there have been a lot of virtual reality experiences from franchises, such as there is Resident Evil, there's Lara Croft, there was a Final Fantasy 15 virtual reality experience, and I think that these larger franchises are still learning themselves, and so I think it's just an iterative process. But I think it's super cool. I've played equally cool franchise virtual reality experiences, like Resident Evil 7 scared me to death, and then I've played smaller ones too that I wouldn't say are franchises that are just as effective. So I think if I'm answering your question correctly, I'm sorry if I'm not, that it's still iterative regardless of franchise, I think. Personally, that's my opinion. Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you for having me. Thanks.